Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome. We are thrilled you're here. My name is Jim Roth, and it's my privilege to serve as the dean here at the Oklahoma City University School of Law. So first I see our students here, so shout out to our students. Thank you for being here. We have some special guests here, and I first wanted to begin with that recognition, the Quinlan family. Would you please stand so we can recognize you? Thank you for your efforts to be here. It's great to see you both. This is an annual event we all look forward to. This is a conversation in the law that is usually on the front edge of issues, as you'll hear here again tonight. So I'll step out of the way and let our Professor Marc Blitz, who also lives on the front edge of issues, constitutional law, stuff that's a little bit scary, to be honest, when he starts talking about deep fakes and things like that. So without further ado, if you'd please help me welcome Professor Marc Blitz.
Thank you. My role here is to introduce our Quinlan speaker for this year, and that is Bhagwat, who is a professor of law at the University of California, Davis. Before that was a professor of law at the University of California, Hastings. At Davis, he is the Buchiver and Bird Endowed Chair for the Study and Teaching of Freedom and Equality. He's also, as I think you'll soon see evidence of, one of the country's leading First Amendment scholars. He received his bachelor's degree, summa cum laude, from Yale University. His JD, Order of the Coif, University of Chicago, then clerked on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals for Judge Richard Posner, and at the United States Supreme Court with Justice Anthony Kennedy. He, just to give you a sense of his contributions to the scholarship on freedom of speech, and he's written also on other subjects, but he is one of the founding editors, right, of the Journal of Free Speech Law, which is a new and already very well-known journal on free speech issues. In fact, the topic that he's going to talk about today, although it's not precisely about the article that he wrote, is closely related to cutting-edge scholarship he's been doing on how freedom of speech relates to social media companies. To give you a sense, if you're not familiar with the scholarship, to give you a sense of what you've been missing, because I think, first of all, the titles themselves are very interesting. So among his articles, which have run in Yale Law Review, William and Mary Law Review, many of the other nation's top law reviews, but among the topics, for instance, are when speech is not speech. It's almost like something you'd hear from the Riddler. The test that ate everything, which is about intermediate scrutiny. And for those of you who studied a little bit, that's actually true. Truthiness, maybe that'll come up, maybe it won't. Otherwise, I'll leave it mysterious. Cloning and federalism. After this talk, when you have time, I'd recommend going and looking at them. If you think the titles are interesting, you have to look at the articles. He's not afraid to challenge First Amendment orthodoxy, and sometimes I have to stop reading because I'm afraid he seems to be actually proving it wrong. He also is the author of a terrific recent book on First Amendment law, Our Democratic First Amendment. And speaking of challenging First Amendment orthodoxy, that does. So actually, after reading it, I feel like I have to apologize to all the students in my classes because it, drawing on a historical study of freedom of speech and other First Amendment rights, freedom of assembly, freedom of press, and the right to petition, he shows that the First Amendment is, in many ways, a lot more than we think it is, and in some respects, quite different than than the way it's described in many prominent free speech cases. So he is also a wonderful colleague. He's been kind enough to read some of my papers and offer constructive criticism, which means he tells me very, very gently and politely why I'm completely wrong. And, but anyway, it's an honor to have him here, Professor Bhagwat.
Thank you so much, Marc. Thank you to the Quinlan family for endowing this lecture and giving me this opportunity. Thank you to Dean Roth and the law school community for having me. Thank you to Professors Marc, Blitz, and Jeremy Tillman for setting this up, and especially to Marc, who has been doing tireless tour guide services today. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I look forward to a good conversation. I'm not going to try and leave lots of time for Q&A and just general discussion. Okay, so starting off, what is the problem that started me thinking in this area? The problem is that there's a widely shared perception that we have lost the concept of trusted communicators. Everyone I think would agree, there is a big partisan divide on even basic facts like the result of the 2022 presidential election, the risks posed by COVID, the role of Russia in the 2016 election, and a whole bunch of other things. There's just a huge divide on facts. And they generally, though not exclusively, fall along partisan grounds. And I think that divide, there are many causes for it, but one of them, I think it is widely believed, is that there was a time when we largely shared common sources of information that we generally trusted in the form of traditional elites, more to talk about that later. And that shared faith has really starkly declined. It's declined across the political spectrum, I think, quite clearly, though I think probably a little bit more on the political right than the political left. And that has led to a concern that without a common shared set of facts, democracy is really hard to do. Because democracy, there's always disagreement. Democracy is built on disagreement. If we all agreed, we wouldn't need to vote. But there was an idea that one can deliberate across disagreements, come up with compromises that we can all live with, which means that if we lose an election, the compromises shift a little bit in one direction. If we lose, but we can live with that and then going back and forth, sharing power. That's good. That's what democracy is. That's really hard to do if you don't start off with any sort of a common starting point. And this concern is manifested by constant attacks by both the media, the traditional media, and by politicians, again, across the political spectrum, but here more on the left, on social media, because social media is perceived as the cause of this development. And especially Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, of course, are the sort of nameplates of people who are hated for their role in spreading disinformation across a wide range of topics. And the perception that they do so and make no effort not to do so. It's seen as a moral failing. So where is all of this coming from? I think to understand the current perceptions, one has to understand the background. And the background is that through most of the 20th century, a handful of institutions controlled public access to information and to who and what we trust. Information we can trust and communicators we can trust. And these institutions were what we call the institutional media. Newspapers originally, and then sort of shared that role with national radio networks in the 20s and the 30s. And then after World War II, dominated by the three national television networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC. These institutions were the trusted communicators of their time, the epitome of trusted communicators being first Edward R. Murrow and then Walter Cronkite, who was in 1972 poll identified as the most trusted man in America. Both of them worked for CBS News, as it happens. So these institutional actors shared a couple of characteristics. First, they were concentrated. In the 19th century, the United States had a plethora of newspapers. Major cities had many, many newspapers, and that was sort of economically plausible. for a number of reasons, primarily having to do with the increasing economics and economies of scale of news gathering. There was an enormous consolidation in the industry, so that by the 1920s, the industry was quite concentrated. In the broadcast media, the same economic factors contributed to concentration, but there was also the fact that by its nature, when we were broadcasting, the phenomenon of spectrum scarcity meant that the number of radio or especially television stations in any market was inevitably limited. So again, there was concentration in these areas, and in the context of national networks, especially because of economies of scale, there were essentially three sources on TV of national and international news, which is the three national networks, and that remained true throughout the television era. And Fox became a fourth network in 1986, and this is around the time when all of this was ending. But it was the creation of Fox News in 1996 that really broke that hold. The other commonality of these entities starting in the 1920s is they insisted on objectivity and nonpartisanship as a model of good journalism. I mean, the newspaper industry, this was, in the first part of the 20th century, this was heavily contested. There was a model of journalism that was associated with William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, which was really about taking positions, being strongly activist. Remember the Maine is the epitome of that kind of journalism. That was Hearst, right? I mean, that was the idea. But in 1896, I believe, a man named Adolph Ochs bought the New York Times. And he, on day one, announced that the New York Times was going to embrace realistic journalism. And there was a long intellectual argument between these two camps, but ultimately Ochs and the New York Times won. By the early 1920s, their view, which was now called objectivity, was embraced, and in fact, in the first journalistic code of ethics adopted in 1926, objectivity was explicitly made a model of good ethical journalism. In the broadcast industry, the same ethical tendencies were exaggerated by the existence of the fairness doctrine. So as many of you know, between 1949 and 1987, the Federal Communications Commission insisted on enforcing something called the fairness doctrine, which required all broadcasters, radio and television, to report on both sides of an issue and gave a right of reply to anyone who was subject to personal attack on the broadcast. This provided enormous incentives to report from the middle, because then you could not be accused of being uneven, and you don't engage in personal attacks, so you don't have to give up valuable airtime. But all of this is true, but I want to emphasize a point, which is that it is also true that their economic incentives encouraged objectivity. In a world of concentration, the way to make money is to maximize audience share. Not to go after niche markets, but you want to have as much of the country as possible watching you. Walter Cronkite did not want just Republicans or Democrats. He wanted the entire country. Nonpartisan objectivity coming from the political center turns out to be the most effective way of doing that. And similarly for major newspapers who want to have big audiences within their areas. And the result was you had these small group of people who were allegedly nonpartisan, allegedly objective, and had basically control over news and could decide also who to trust. For example, a famous interview by Edward R. Murrow of Jonas Salk, the inventor of the polio vaccine, was a key moment in faith in vaccines. 50 years later, more than 50 years later. Two things also about this. This is an anomaly. Historically, the press was not nonpartisan or objective. Newspapers from the early Republic through the Civil War and post-Reconstruction era were explicitly partisan. They didn't deny that. They were associated with political parties. And that was seen to be fine. Indeed, that was seen to be normal. Second, the trust the public had in these institutional entities was a product of the fact that they had no choice. There were no other voices to be heard. The radical voices were limited to the radical fringes, in which in American society truly were fringes on the left and the right. But the basic messaging that was coming was in a very narrow political spectrum, right around the center. Some, like the New York Times, leaning maybe a little left of center, the Wall Street Journal a little right of center, but that was basically it. And in that world in which also in the Cold War era, partisan divisions were more muted, this was a system that worked pretty well. But it had consequences, which is one, the voices that were heard were limited, and two, we never knew what we didn't know. If the journalists chose not to tell us things like about JFK's philandering, we're never going to know, right? There was no access to that information. So all of this started to collapse in the 1980s. In 1987, the FCC eliminated the Fairness Doctrine, and in 1988, the next year, Rush Limbaugh became syndicated, and the right-wing sort of talk radio arose as a thing. Couldn't have happened under the Fairness Doctrine. In 1996, Fox News was created, and it was so economically successful that the concept of strong nonpartisanship came under financial pressure. And there were technological developments as well, which is the explosion of cable television during this period of time also meant there were many more voices to be heard. But again, it was not that many voices. It was, of course, the rise of the internet that utterly collapsed the notion of trusted communicators. And even then, early on, there were blogs, there was this, there was that, but not that many people were active on the internet. In 2006, social media came into being. Twitter was created in 2006, and that is also the year Facebook became available to the general public. But early on, actually, their growth was important, but it was not displacing the rest of the media. The key was smartphones. The fact that because once people had access to social media on smartphones, they became the dominant source of information for most people. The first iPhone was released in 2007. And by around 2009, 2010, they were in common use. Google had also issued its Android operating system by then, and so there were more smartphones. That is when the shift started to occur and social media became dominant, and that is when the concept of gatekeepers and trusted communicators collapsed. Because all of a sudden, people had access to a multitude of voices. Anyone could speak. There was no limit on what could be heard. And as a result, we replaced sort of a very controlled public discourse with chaos and cacophony. And in that world, people, because people are who they are, began to seek out voices that reinforced their own pre-existing beliefs and prejudices and biases. And unlike the institutional media, social media not only let them do it, they encourage them to do it, because that creates engagement. And I'll talk more about engagement in a sec. Now, I'm not going to say the internet was the sole cause of all of this. Political polarization was happening before the internet, in the 1990s, for example, during the Clinton impeachment and all of that. And it probably would have happened anyway, especially because of the economic consequences of increases in free trade, especially after China entered the WTO in 2001. But there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that polarization has become much sharper as a consequence of social media. As became evident during the 2016 presidential election, which was so bitterly disputed. And earlier elections had been disputed, but not like that one. And frankly, the politicization of the COVID epidemic, which also demonstrates divisions that are starkly sort of more sharper. So all of this has happened, and it is no doubt a product of social media. The result is concerning for a lot of people, because of this concern that without common factual assumptions and with sharper and sharper polarization, it's hard to do democracy. And the difficulty is social media tends to push us into our own echo chambers in which our own beliefs just simply get reinforced. And the result has been what I can only call existential angst among elites, especially media and political elites. And it's reflected in daily op-eds in the Washington Post and the New York Times, calling Mark Zuckerberg the worst person ever born, and calling social media a catastrophe, and saying it's terrible because they do nothing to suppress misinformation. Similar calls from politicians, both Senators Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar have introduced legislation requiring social media companies to suppress some forms of disinformation, especially medical disinformation during the pandemic. So that's the world in which we live. And I'm focusing on this is not the only critique of social media. There's a whole other set of critiques about over-censorship, which I spoke about at lunch, and I'm happy to answer questions about, but this is the one I'm talking about today. So what is my response? I agree that we have a problem, but I'm not very confident of the solutions that are proposed. First, I'm absolutely confident that legally requiring social media to suppress misinformation, except in the narrowest possible way, maybe about like locations of polling places or something, but otherwise it's clearly unconstitutional. Social media companies have editorial rights to choose what to publish and what not to publish. I can explain why on Q&A. And false speech is fully protected. United States versus Alvarez, 2012. That's not going to happen. But the political pressures on these companies continue. But I still think that's a mistake. Starting off with, they have no economic incentives to be gatekeepers. What social media firms care about is relevance and engagement, eyeballs. They don't care about objectivity or truth. The institutional media, as I emphasized, had economic incentives to be objective and seemingly nonpartisan. Social media firms have none. They have an advertising-driven model which wants engagement, and nonpartisanship does not excite. Partisanship excites and causes engagement. And I'm very dubious that we're going to successfully convince companies to do things that they have no economic incentive to do. Second, social media firms have no aptitude, training, or expertise to be gatekeepers. They are software engineers. They are not journalists. They are not historians. They are not economists. And training Mark Zuckerberg to be a journalist or a historian is kind of like trying to train Walter Cronkite to code. It's not going to happen. I think it's unrealistic. And relatedly, I'm very dubious that the algorithms that they run can do this. Everyone assumes you can write an algorithm to discover truth. I'm like, really? Engagement, relevance, sure. You can count eyeballs and clicks, but truth? That's a pretty ephemeral thing to try and code. I think we need a lot more AI before we can do that. And it's because truth is ephemeral, right? Furthermore, the history here is mixed. I think both the fiasco of the social media companies originally on the advice of elites, labeling the lab leak theory of COVID origin as misinformation, I'm not saying it's true, but it's at least today we take it seriously enough that the Biden administration's investigating it. It was originally labeled misinformation. That was a fiasco. The Hunter Biden laptop story and suppressing it was also in retrospect a fiasco. They're not good at this, and I'm not sure why we think they're going to be any good at it. And frankly, when we look at media and political elites who want social media firms to suppress misinformation and disinformation, they're notably vague about what that means, right? I think in their view, disinformation is anything they don't believe. But that's not going to work, right? I mean, that's basically saying, let us be the elites again. No, that era is over. There's no going back. And finally, and most fundamentally, and I'm going to stop after this, I think the very idea of gatekeeping is in deep tension with basic principles of free expression. The problem is, fundamentally, that the First Amendment assumes that truth is ephemeral and that it's rediscovered over time. And that makes the gatekeeper function troubling because we're sort of stamping saying, this is the truth, this is what can be said. It's not what we have free speech for. If we look at the two sort of definitional explanations of free speech theory, the first is Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.'s theory of the marketplace of ideas. It's expressed in his dissent in Abrams versus the United States in 1919, which is the foundational free speech opinion in the history of the United States, in which he says that the reason we should protect free speech is because the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. The second, and to my mind more compelling, explanation for why we protect free speech is in the opinion of Justice Louis Brandeis, joined by Holmes, as Brandeis joined Holmes's opinion in Abrams, in Whitney versus California in 1927, which is my favorite judicial opinion of all time, and it's very short and everyone should read it, in which he says that the argument is, well, but there are these terrible ideas. Whitney was a communist. There are these terrible ideas, and we need to suppress them because they're so dangerous. And his response was to say, no. When faced with false or dangerous speech, normally, quote, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence. Both of these foundational accounts are based on an assumption, which is that the reason we protect free speech is because of the role of free speech in democracy and the role of citizens in democracy. And it assumes that it's citizens who should be participating in and ultimately evaluating public discourse. And that they're the ones who are engaging in the deliberation that eventually results in, if not the truth, at least decent outcomes. But the concept of gatekeepers is anathema to that. And I would note that these opinions were written at the very beginning of the gatekeeper era, because gatekeepers assume that someone else is going to decide what the boundaries of acceptable discourse is, or acceptable truth is, or acceptable ideas is, and so forth and so on. And I just think that that is not what the First Amendment is about. This is not technically about the First Amendment. If it's legal requirements, it's about the First Amendment. It doesn't permit it. But I'm suggesting that the First Amendment doctrine prohibiting these kinds of legal requirements is correct. And when we're talking about political pressure, it's not, of course, the First Amendment. Facebook can do what it wants. It's a private actor. But I still think it's a mistake based on the philosophy of free speech to pressure them to act as gatekeepers. I don't think that's an appropriate role. And I am not claiming that we have a great marketplace of ideas, that the truth will out. I lack Holmes's and Brandeis's optimism. We obviously have problems. What I am saying is that the solving our problems by creating a new set of frankly second-rate gatekeepers, because there will be second-rate, is not the solution. We need to come up with ways of coming up with common sources of information that we can trust across partisan lines that do not involve arbitrary limitations on what may be said. We need to recreate trust, and as a consequence, we need to recreate public discourse that accepts disagreement, even profound disagreement, but somehow makes it possible to at least talk across partisan lines, which we seem to have largely lost the ability to do. If you ask me how we achieved those goals, I'm going to say if I knew that, I'd be rich, and not an academic. But I don't know the answer to that. That's a really difficult question. I have some thoughts where we could start, but I certainly don't have a sort of a set answer. But I think that's what we should be thinking about rather than thinking about trying to recreate Walter Cronkite, because that ain't going to happen. Genie's out of the bottle, never gets stuffed back in. Thank you. Happy to take questions. Yeah.
So what are your ideas on how we can?
So I think that the most successful model for truth in the internet era has been Wikipedia. People trust Wikipedia. It is not controlled by traditional elites, so those biases are not there. It's crowdsourced. I think that's a model we should be able to build on. I think it's really important that it not be controlled by sort of people who the population has lost faith in. But that's, I think, and I think that we need a lot more nonprofits, because for-profit is tricky, because then there's the engagement advertising problem. But I think we need a lot more nonprofits in which groups of people who know something about a subject but are not partisanly affiliated try to come up with websites and other sources of information on that model that are more crowdsourced and more just.
Do you have an idea how to move people to look to those sources?
I would like to believe that if you build it, they will come. You can't, this is the thing, right, is that any system that proposes to limit what people can see or what they cannot see or tries to push them in one direction, as all social media reform from the left and the right tries to do, to my mind is really missing the point. If we trusted the government to decide what we should see, we would not need a First Amendment, and believe me, we need a First Amendment, right? So I don't think you can force people. I think that you can educate. I think that outreach and education is part of developing these new sources, but this is very, very preliminary. This is something I'm just starting to think about, but I don't see any other solution.
As far as the reliability for sources like that, like we're always told, like you can't trust Wikipedia, don't look to Wikipedia. How would you, if that was what you'd recommend people go to for truth or what's an unbiased opinion, how would you then be able to say this is actually reliable or believable?
So let me ask a question. When someone asks you a question on a fact, where do you first go?
Usually, Wikipedia's the first thing to pop up.
I mean, who doesn't, right? Don't trust Wikipedia, except that all 300 and whatever million of us trust Wikipedia. It's where we go first. And in fact, recent studies suggest Wikipedia has a lower error rate than the Encyclopedia Britannica. So you don't stop at Wikipedia, I would concede that, but don't trust Wikipedia is, I mean, I think, there's an old guard of people, and there's a lot of industries that have been utterly disrupted by the internet and by social media. And the two obvious ones are general information sort of recovery, like libraries and things like that, and most obviously the traditional media. Of course they don't trust the internet, right? Because economically for their businesses, it's been a disaster. I'm not suggesting that there can be a single, let's use a controversial example, let's use a current one, Russia-Ukraine, right? I'm not suggesting you can create a single database that everyone is going to trust on Russia-Ukraine. But I think you might be able to create a database that's generally trustworthy, that people are willing to go to start, and then when they read other stuff, maybe they're reading it with a somewhat more critical eye, right? When you run across the sort of Putin disinformation that is, the U.S. bioweapons that labs that the Ukrainian government was running, which is just a lie. I mean, you at least have some critical ability to say, that seems awfully inconsistent with what people have in this site said about those labs, which is that they were Soviet labs that we're trying to dismantle and control. I would hope, if ultimately people have lost all ability to think critically, well, then I think we kind of are doomed. But I don't believe that. I continue to have some faith in common citizens to actually, when given the tools they need, to actually be able to be effective.
Your talk focuses appropriately on core political speech.
Yes.
I wonder, have you thought about whether or not there's a role for gatekeepers outside of core political speech? For example, could we police civility? By simply, even within existing doctrine, let's say, you can say whatever you want about public figures, but could there be legislation, or can we trust the new gatekeepers to say, we're just not going to allow personal attacks about private citizens, vicious personal attacks?
So, it's funny, I had a long conversation about this very recently on the internet with two other First Amendment scholars, in which we all disagreed. So that's so obviously there's no consensus on this.
Yeah.
I am very dubious that you can write legislation to deal with civility that is not void for vagueness and is not in some way politically biased. I just don't know how you could do that. It's Cohen versus California. This is the case in which in 1972, during the Vietnam War, someone walks into a courtyard with a jacket that says F the draft, and he wins. He's prosecuted in California, and he wins. And I think the reasons expressed in that opinion are still true, which is that it's really hard to define civility. And sometimes incivility is appropriate. See, that's where I disagree with Jim Weinstein at Arizona State, is the person I was arguing with, as a good friend. I just think sometimes incivility is, in fact, the right approach towards, if you were to ask me my honest opinion about Vladimir Putin right now, I would not be civil. And that's just true. Should it be a goal? Of course. 95% of the time, of course it should be a goal. Should social media firms have a role in that? I think yes, but this comes to what I was talking about at lunch, but I think that makes it particularly important that there be a plethora of platforms, that we sort of encourage competition through antitrust law as much as possible, because I think civility can very easily become a tool for basically preferring particular viewpoints, which Facebook can do, right? They have a right to do that. If Facebook wants to be the left-wing Facebook and Telegram wants to be the right-wing Facebook, it doesn't thrill me, but that's plausible, right? I don't think social media is the right tool to accomplish the kind of dialogue that surmounts political polarization that I'm looking for. I think that it's a inherently flawed tool. That's actually why I think moving, because of the profit motive. And I live in Northern California, I don't begrudge those people their hundreds of billions of dollars. They're welcome to it. But I don't think they're expecting them to be that and be strong, positive, sort of social actors is probably unrealistic. Yeah.
What qualities do you think made Walter Cronkite the most trusted man in America? And do you see anyone in our current situation who comes anywhere close?
So I think what Cronkite achieved this by being extremely dispassionate, for one thing. Like, he really just did not engage in histrionics ever. And I think he did it by trying to convey the idea that he was, whenever he expressed his own opinion, he would say he was doing that and do it as rarely as possible. But I also think, there's this very famous moment in the history of Walter Cronkite in which Cronkite went to Vietnam during the Tet Offensive in February of 1968. And he reported, and he was reporting it accurately, he reported it correctly as actually a military defeat for North Vietnam, but it was a shock. And at the end of it all, he did a broadcast in which he said, after all of the facts, he said, this reporter thinks that this war can only end in a stalemate. 1968. The story is that Lyndon Johnson, the president, was watching this broadcast, and he just fell back in his chair, his aide reports, and said, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost America. And as a result, he didn't run for re-election. He withdrew from the 1968 Democratic sort of nominating process, and that's how Richard Nixon became elected. Maybe it would have been anyway, who knows. But I think that's impossible to do today, because Walter Cronkite is saying this and all of America is watching. Today, there'll be someone saying, no, the North Vietnamese actually are routed and they barely exist anymore. And there's someone else who's going to be saying, no, the North Vietnamese are on the verge of taking over South Vietnam, which was also not true. And recreating that center figure, I think this is my point, is concentration was pretty essential to that. Right? This is the sort of trying to say bygone era. Was that a better era? Some ways yes, some ways no. I think the no part is that certainly it someone was deciding what was the range of acceptable opinions, and it wasn't necessarily people deciding for themselves. On the other hand, this current cacophony has its own problems. I just don't see, unless we ban the internet, which, tellingly, Putin and China are kind of trying to do, right? But that's very telling, right? Because, that's sort of recreating a single narrative. So China has never allowed US social media companies in. Russia had them, but they all got kicked out after the Ukraine war started. I think that tells us a lot about the mentality that wants to sort of end this kind of access to information, right? But you're right, the downside is it's going to be a heck of a lot harder to recreate that kind of trust. Yeah, Tim?
Yeah, I was curious about your thoughts on maybe the roles of current media companies in filling that gatekeeper title, because many ways in which social media users get the news is through sharing of articles from reputable news sources such as the New York Times, or depending on your definition of reputable or accuracy. And I interestingly recently had Simon Tam be a guest in my IB class, and he was the named plaintiff of, as you know, the U.S. Supreme Court case of Mattal versus Tam. And he told me a very interesting anecdote when he was going around the press blitz and interviewed by all the major media companies. He was just realizing that many of them were inaccurate and didn't understand the full nuances in the law.
Yeah.
And the only two outlets that intensely fact-checked every single line were NPR and Comedy Central. Comedy Central, because he was showing up on the Daily Show.
Uh-huh.
So it was almost like, is there that what's the concerned now if the only two sources we can really trust are NPR and
Comedy
Comedy
Central.
Central.
And NPR is a nonprofit, I would add,
Right.
which is telling.
Right.
Yeah, so great story. I'd not heard that. I've actually met Simon Tam several times. He spoke at Davis twice. My colleague, then colleague, Anupam Chunder, was on just a blitz to try and get him to enroll in our law school, but he never did. So the problem is this, is that as they lost their gates, because they're not gatekeepers anymore, right? And by the way, I know I tend to focus on the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and New York Times when I'm looking for information. Most people are not that discerning. I know plenty of people, including very well-educated people with multiple graduate degrees, who regularly go down weird internet rabbit holes. So I think that the idea that they're playing a gatekeeper role is, the truth of the matter is I don't think it's true. They also, because they're not gatekeepers, and because therefore they no longer have the ability to have huge audience shares, their economic incentives are to be sort of dispassionate in the Cronkite model. Their economic incentives are to, democracy dies in the dark, right? Isn't that the Washington Post new model? That's not a neutral, objective model, right? That was a very, very explicit comment about the Trump administration, and please subscribe to me because of that, right? And by the way, it worked. WAPO and the New York Times had huge increases in subscriptions during the early years of the Trump administration. But that's because they weren't trying to be nonpartisan, right? And one of the things, this is a long story, but since the 90s, but accelerating now, there is an active argument within the journalistic community about whether or not objectivity is in fact even an appropriate journalistic goal. Because objectivity in American journalism often comes out on this sort of this side, then the other side approach, which is fine if there are really two sides to the issue, but this side to the historian of the Holocaust, this side to the Holocaust denier, that's a travesty of objectivity, and yet that's what people talk about now. And so there's also a sense that objectivity and this is I think politically valenced, is that objectivity can sort of mean the media is failing in its role to sort of drive society. Notice that is back to the Hearst-Pulitzer model, right? And I think that's very telling as well. So I don't think so. I think again, because they're for-profits, I think their economic incentives are just all wrong. I think NPR is telling it's not a for-profit, so it doesn't rely on advertising in quite the same way, or subscriptions. And Comedy Central I can't explain, except that I suspect that's just Jon Stewart, who was the Walter Cronkite of his era, I think, insofar as there was one. But not really, right? Because he wasn't even a journalist, he was a comedian. Yeah.
I just had a question because I know that you kind of focused a lot on social media being the gatekeeper for not the gatekeeper, they should not be a gatekeeper,
Yeah.
these companies. But I was curious what your thoughts were. Yes, we have the First Amendment to protect us from the government censoring our speech, from protecting the government from making social media companies censor speech. But I was curious what your thoughts were on John Stuart Mill talked a lot about the problem. Yes, we can worry about the government, but let's talk about this tyranny of the minority, that the tyranny of then the majority would come in and suppress speech. So what about the social media users that are actively suppressing the speech of others by doxing or doing other things like that,
I understand. So I have a pretty simple answer to that, which is, and the conference I was at 2 weeks ago was actually on that very question. My answer is I just think that stuff is not protected speech. I think sometimes there are difficult line drawing issues, but I don't, social media companies should be encouraged, I don't think they can be forced, to police that kind of behavior, and I think that's entirely appropriate. It's not a part of any sort of democratic dialogue, because the difference is you have a perfect right to harshly criticize people. That is, and that's why I think the civility norm, sometimes it's fair, and that's sometimes, I think some people, including journalists, do not. Barry Weiss is an example of someone who gave up her position in the New York Times because people were being mean to her. It's like, and she said she had no voice. I'm like, call him in the New York Times. What do you mean you have no voice? You have one of the loudest voices in this country. But that's different. What you are talking about is the kind of piling on, often accompanied, by the way, with things like threats, which are clearly unprotected. and almost always targeted at women, which is particularly awful. Social media companies should be strongly encouraged to police that stuff, as they all say they try to do. And I am perfectly happy prosecuting people who do that. First of all, threats, there's no First Amendment barrier to prosecuting threats. It turns out it's really hard to get law enforcement to pay any attention. And this is what Danielle Citron was talking about at this conference. It's really hard she was apparently the last Quinlan speaker before me. I didn't know that. She's a friend. Her point is that getting law enforcement to pay attention is very difficult. And so we have this problem where we have behavior that is clearly prosecutable, but almost never gets prosecuted. And I think maybe we should think about where we're putting our resources, right?
So I agree with you that Brandeis's opinion and Whitney's, I get to teach it next week, is one of the classics of American constitutional law, and it's wonderful. But so is Justice Sanford's opinion in the same case. It is also a wonderful and thoughtful opinion. And the problem is that we need to reopen those debates. Brandeis is persuasive, so is Sanford. I'm not sure there's anything in the text structure of the history of American Constitution that gives the Supreme Court the power to make that decision itself. That decision ought to be made at the legislative level, whether Brandeis's policy regarding the right way of dealing with that kind of interaction or Sanford's policy was correct. We need to reopen the debate about whether or not the Westboro Baptist people should be able to use the intentional infliction of emotional distress, the way they purvey their political views. That is something we just need to rethink and reopen. Yes, we all should be able to say our way, but we should be able to agree to a set of rules about how to do it, no matter what our side.
So I half agree with you. I think that we need to rethink a lot of issues. The internet has really changed the game by completely democratizing speech. I think the defamation law, for example, needs a careful rethink. I also, however, know that the first words of the First Amendment are Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. And it cannot be a coincidence that Congress is the focus, right? I mean, the First Amendment is an explicit limitation on congressional authority because the framers did not trust Congress to make these judgments. And
their assumption was the states had complete power.
That's true. And to some extent, that is true. But I certainly don't trust the states, given where current politics are. And let me be fair. Just as I do not trust Texas and Florida, I do not trust my own state of California either on these topics. But I mean, look at Congress, right? I mean, we would like to think of it as a deliberative body that's going to think these things through. Does anyone believe that? I mean, the difficulty is if our politics as a country have been degraded, that is nothing to where Congress has been degraded. I mean, the confirmation hearings on I refused to watch them because they would just upset me too much. But they were a travesty, right? I mean, they were something that sort of you could, like, can you imagine if 50 years ago someone had told this is where the Senate is going to be in the year 2022? I don't know what the right institution is, and maybe this is a really different topic and way outside of my sort of expertise. But unless Congress is reinvented as an institution, I just don't see them capable of making those decisions. Right now, you look at the legislative proposals in Congress, and they're coming from hard and fast from the left and the right, right? Everyone agrees Section 230 is terrible, we need to regulate the internet. But if you look at the actual legislation, for some reason, all of the left-wing proposals benefit Democrats, and all of the right-wing proposals benefit Republicans. And I'm just like, what a coincidence, right? I mean, this is like meaningful reform. I mean, right? I mean, this is why Section 230 can't be amended, even though it needs amendment. I actually agree it needs amended, is because once you open that Pandora's box, there can be no agreement. And in a 50-50 Congress, right? I mean, unless someone is willing to get rid of the filibuster, which, I'm not sure how I feel about.
If you'll indulge me a comment, Lee Hamilton, who spent 34 years in Congress, has for the last 20 years anyway described Congress as dysfunctional.
Yep. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And it wasn't. even in the 90s, Congress was able to reach compromises that Clinton, as with a Republican Congress and a Democratic president, important compromises, some of which I'm very unhappy with in retrospect, but that they were able to sign into law. I don't want to see that happening today, except on issues that are very nonpartisan. There are some.
So, I think this is just a request for clarification. You're talking about social media companies' unsuitability for being gatekeepers.
Yes.
You're talking primarily about pressure on them to engage in content moderation.
Yes.
Either to keep it off the site or possibly to label it, and they're often getting it wrong by saying this is information, and maybe having to take it back.
Yes.
But do you have any concerns about attempts to engage in what I think would be content neutral measures, or pressuring social media companies to use content neutral measures to undercut the industrial scale, what Jonathan Rauch and others have described as industrial scale methods of spreading disinformation? So bots, right? There's a law in California now actually preventing bots. So the idea there would be, it doesn't matter what one is saying, although the focus of the law I think is on election speech and commercial speech. But it's what you don't want is people being fooled into thinking that there are thousands of people saying it when it's one person with using bots. Or other means, but I guess I'm also wondering whether there's some things that maybe have a little bit of content. So, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, that Cass Sunstein, for example, has wanted a kind of fairness doctrine idea that you can steer, not that something will be labeled misinformation, but people will be at least given, encouraged to look at this alternative point of view. Now, it may be that most of us just aren't interested.
Yeah. So Erwin Chemerinsky has also published something recently arguing in favor of the fairness doctrine. I don't think that works on social media. I think that the reality is, again, it was the concentration of the networks that allowed fairness doctrine to be operative. I don't think, there's a billion sources out there. Who do we pick as the other side? Right? And is it really true that when someone puts up a history of the Holocaust, we're going to say, you should look at, I don't see how to do that in a viewpoint neutral way. But leaving aside the specifics, I certainly believe, whether the First Amendment would permit prohibiting amplification, I don't know. It seems to me, but maybe automated. It's an interesting question. This is really unresolved, right? As to what extent does the First Amendment protect your right to write a bot that amplifies speech? Is that really speech? I would have to think about that really hard for a long time, and I have not yet done that. Is it a good idea? Yeah, it really is. So Facebook actually already adopted something in WhatsApp and in Facebook Messenger, which prevents fast spreading. If you see a message that's starting to go viral, it actually slows it down. And the reason is that kind of virality was closely associated with a bunch of mob attacks in India, primarily on Muslims, based on fake information about killing a cow or something like that. But there was evidence that was happening in a number of countries. India particularly, because WhatsApp is a dominant platform there. And so they actually acted voluntarily. They said this is dangerous and there's no particular upside to having a particular message spread to 30,000 people in 2 seconds. I'm fully in favor of that kind of stuff, yeah. But like I said, I think right now voluntary is the best path. If we have to regulate, well, then maybe you and I should co-author that law review article, because I don't know what the right answer is. Because, for example, I am confident that prohibiting targeted speech is unconstitutional. I'm confident that part of your right to speak is the right to speak to the audience of your choice. Because otherwise, ponder what the government could do, right? If it gets to say, yeah, you're welcome to speak, but only to these people who don't care. So those kinds of reforms, I think, are out of the question. But bots amplification, yeah, maybe. That's a path. I also think you can set some sort of due process-like reforms that give users some right to object to blocking or being deplatformed, as long as they're written really carefully to be content neutral and to not create impossible burdens on smaller social media firms. Yeah. Yeah.
And do you have thoughts then? I mean, the value of Gatekeeper is that it limited the information coming at you.
Yeah.
And right now, we just get overwhelmed with so many different things. It's part of the appeal of going to your favorite source.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on how young people today can replace that gatekeeper? How are they going to analyze and deal with this flood?
I will confess that I find young people the most difficult thing. I will reveal that my daughter is a middle school teacher, and she sees it, where just her students who are, sixth through 8th graders, they just have no critical sense of what they read on the internet. Perhaps, no, it's not going to happen. I was going to say maybe some parental limits on their use of phones, but they'll hack themselves around it like that. So it's expecting a parent to be able to outmaneuver technologically a teenager is completely pie in the sky. So I think we just have to really, really focus on educating them at an early age to be critical absorbers of information. It needs to become a fundamental part of the curriculum starting in 1st grade. Because even though they don't have phones in 1st grade, they have siblings who do, often. And certainly, I think in this day and age, certainly by 5th grade, most kids have smartphones. So this starts really early, this problem. And it can be things like, it's TikTok, right? The misinformation that my daughter is observing is these kids watching things on TikTok that are just patently untrue. And she's a scientist, so they're like, often science will show you, she says, no, that's not true. And so I just, and I think that that's the only solution. Other than taking smartphones away from kids, but again, that's not gonna happen. I mean, especially because so much education has gone online that actually I'm not sure you can do. Be an effective sort of student, especially if you come from a poorer family and do not have great land-based internet access at home. I think your phone is an essential tool of your education now.
But should we remove the word smart from it?
So perhaps civility and critical thinking needs to start in kindergarten?
So the thing that we abandoned when
Then some parent will say, you can't teach my child that, so.
Well, I've never understood this argument. We can teach our children whatever they want. I mean, it's like there may be some limits, but we've been making choices about what to include in the curriculum ever since there have been mandatory public schooling, right? I mean, that's just a thing. And when parents choose private schools, they choose those schools for the content. If a parent chooses to send their kid to Catholic school, it's not shocking that they're taught Catholic doctrine. And similarly, this is this thing that came up during the confirmation hearings. When parents choose to send their kids to Georgetown Day, which is the school that the judge was on the board of, in which a bunch of I went to public school, but a bunch of my friends from college went to that school. It is famously known as the most hippy-dippy school in the DC area, right? What do you expect? It's a private school. You pay $40,000 a year to attend. But in public school, of course, we've been able to set the curriculum. And I don't see what there may be some legitimate limits. I'm not going to suggest that anything is a go, but I can't see what legitimate argument a parent has towards not training your kid to be a critical thinker. And civility, we do try and teach them. The problem is, in our headlong emphasis on language testing, which means language and math in elementary school, and then sciences in middle and high school, we've given up most of that curriculum. And maybe we should rethink that a little bit.
I think we have time for one more question. My role is gatekeeper.
But not trusted communicator.
Yeah. So if someone has a question that will just resolve this issue. Mike, any last questions? Then can we please thank Professor Bhagwat?
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for attending. This was actually an incredibly interesting conversation. I really enjoyed it.
There is a reception nearby.